The man in the shadows. The history of the Soviet Union knows many executioners, but this man stands apart. He was the one who turned chaotic, revolutionary terror into a flawlessly operating state machine. He became the first General Commissioner of State Security in history. His name is Genrikh Yagoda, the man who built the Gulag, only to later become camp dust. The man who dreamed of limitless power, but ended his life on his knees, begging for mercy. Birth and masks. It all began on November 7th, by New Style, the 19th, 1891. In the city of Rybinsk, in the Yaroslavl province, a boy was born into a Jewish family. At birth, he was given the name Enoch, but he would enter history as Genrikh. His family was remarkable even by the standards of that time. His father, Grigory Filipovich, was a skilled goldsmith. His grandfather, a retired soldier named Betrayal Yagoda, achieved a unique right. They were permitted to live outside the Pale of Settlement, the closed zones where the empire forced the Jewish population to live. They became the first Jewish family to settle in Rybinsk. The family owned real estate, rented out houses for workshops, and lived in prosperity. But Genrikh's fate was predetermined not by his father's wealth, but by family ties. The Yagoda clan was closely intertwined with the Sverdlov family. Genrikh's father was a cousin to Mikhail Sverdlov, and Mikhail's son, Yakov Sverdlov, would soon become one of the most powerful men of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Black Devil of the party. These ties would play a fatal role. Later, Yagoda would marry his second cousin, Ida Averbach, the niece of that very same Yakov Sverdlov. The path of a rebel and forger. Young Genrikh did not want to follow in his jeweler father's footsteps. In 1907, being only a 15-year-old teenager, he joined the anarchist communists in Nizhny Novgorod. It was a time of bombs, expropriations, and the romance of the underground. In 1911, he was entrusted with a dangerous mission. He had to contact the Moscow anarchists to organize a bank robbery. But in the summer of 1912, his career as a raider was cut short. The 20-year-old Yagoda was arrested in Moscow. He was living there illegally under a false name, with a forged passport in the name of Galushkin. The gendarmes interrogating him noted with surprise a detail that characterized his lack of principles. The young revolutionary planned to convert to Orthodoxy, just to gain the right to live and work in the empire's capital. The court sentenced him to 2 years of exile in Simbirsk. There, he immediately began writing petitions to the governor, complaining of his extremely painful condition and poverty. But luck smiled on him in a different way. In 1913, in honor of the 300th anniversary of the House of Romanov, a broad amnesty was declared. The term of exile was reduced, and Yagoda was released. He immediately moved to St. Petersburg and, casting aside prejudices, converted to Orthodoxy to legalize his status. Much later, when he became the all-powerful head of the secret services, the truth about his past would surface. In 1930, his deputy Trilisser, an old convict, decided to check his boss's biography. It turned out that Yagoda's heroic revolutionary biography was a lie. He attributed to himself membership in the party since 1907 and active struggle against Tsarism. In reality, he joined the Bolsheviks only in the summer of 1917, when victory was already near. Rise to the top of Lubyanka. The October Revolution of 1917 opened all doors for him. Yagoda found himself at the right time in the right place, and, most importantly, with the right patrons. In 1919, he was noticed by Yakov Sverdlov and Felix Dzerzhinsky. the creator of the Cheka, the punishing sword of the revolution. Yagoda was transferred to Moscow. He began a rapid ascent up the ladder of terror. Business manager of the Special Department of the Cheka, member of the Presidium of the Cheka, second deputy chairman of the OGPU. After the death of Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky in 1926, the agency was headed by Vyacheslav Menjinsky. But Menjinsky was seriously ill. Menjinsky's illness created a unique situation. Formally, he remained the head of the OGPU, but he practically did not manage the agency. All decisions were made by Yagoda. He signed orders, supervised operations, and controlled personnel. For the first time in the history of Soviet secret services, power was in the hands of a man who did not officially hold the highest post. Yagoda ruled from the shadows for years, getting used to absolute control and impunity. Actual power over the secret police of the vast country passed into the hands of Genrikh Yagoda. It was during this period that terror ceased to be chaotic and acquired a bureaucratic form. Under Yagoda, repression began to be formalized as a managed process for the first time. Instructions, reports, internal memos, and regulations appeared. Arrests, transfers, sentences, and executions became part of the administrative routine. The Chekist ceased to be a fanatic and turned into an official. A person's death was now formalized not by a scream and a shot, but by a signature on a document. He became a master of intrigue and covert operations. In 1927, he directed the brutal dispersal of anti-Stalinist demonstrations, proving his loyalty to the new leader, Joseph Stalin. Yagoda loved luxury and power, but he also sought recognition. On August 4, 1933, the Order of Lenin adorned his chest. The award was presented for a project that became the symbol of slave labor in the 20th century, the construction of the White Sea Canal. The Gulag Empire. It was under Yagoda's leadership that the Gulag system was created. A network of forced labor camps entangled the country. Under Yagoda, camps ceased to be merely a place for isolating enemies. They turned into an economic resource for the state. The prisoner became a labor unit. His life was measured by the production quota. His death was accounted for as an acceptable loss. It was under Yagoda that the idea of using forced labor as the foundation for industrial projects was finally formulated. Timber, canals, roads, mines, construction sites. All of this was built by the hands of people deprived of rights and a future. The camps became part of the planned economy. They obeyed the same principles as factories: reports, plans, percentages of completion. Human life dissolved into numbers. For Stalin, this was the ideal solution. Political enemies were destroyed slowly, while the state received results. Yagoda managed to offer the regime exactly the form of terror that was profitable for the authorities. This was his main danger. He did not just repress, he integrated repression into the country's management system. Yagoda became the ideological leader of the socialist industry of the taiga and the north. To glorify the use of prisoner slave labor, he organized a grand propaganda campaign. 36 famous writers, led by Maxim Gorky, traveled to the White Sea Canal to sing the praises of reforging people through labor. Yagoda's vanity knew no bounds. Behind the facade of state strictness lay personal decay. Yagoda lived in luxury, unavailable, even to many members of the Politburo. Contemporaries and investigative materials mentioned his addiction to drugs and alcohol. While millions of people died of cold and hunger in the camps, he collected antiques, threw parties, and furnished dachas. The contrast between the Gulag system and the lifestyle of its creator was monstrous. A monument in his honor was erected at the last lock of the canal. It was a 30-meter five-pointed star. Inside the star, like a pagan deity, stood a giant bronze bust of Genrikh Yagoda himself. In July 1934, he reached the peak of his power. The NKVD of the USSR, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was formed. Yagoda headed this monster. In 1935, he was the first in history to be awarded the title General Commissioner of State Security. The strange liberal and the beginning of the end. However, contradictions were brewing inside the punitive machine. These contradictions appeared as early as the beginning of the 30s. During the period of Stalin's struggle with the internal party opposition, Yagoda acted cautiously. He oversaw the Ryutin affair and a number of other anti-Stalinist groups, but avoided mass executions. Many sentences were limited to exile and camps. Yagoda believed that the system could be maintained without the total extermination of the old Bolsheviks. This belief became his strategic mistake. Despite creating the camps, Yagoda began to show a strange softness regarding executions. In the summer of 1934, in a conversation with the head of the secret political department, Molchanov, he uttered a seditious phrase. "It is time, perhaps, to stop shooting people," said the country's chief Chekist. He, like part of the elite, hoped that the time of the Great Terror had passed and an era of stability was arriving. This was the delusion of a man used to thinking in categories of managed violence. Yagoda believed that terror could be dosed, that fear should be a tool, not hysteria. He did not understand the main thing. For Stalin, terror was not a means. It was the goal. But Stalin had other plans. On December 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov, Stalin's associate, was killed in Leningrad. This murder became the trigger for the Great Terror. Stalin demanded blood and the exposure of global conspiracies. Yagoda organized the first show trials, tried Kamenev and Zinoviev, but did so without proper enthusiasm. He resisted the complete fabrication of cases about underground organizations. Stalin sensed the hesitation of his executioner. A new, more cruel executor was entering the stage, Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov's appearance was not sudden. He gradually displaced Yagoda, using denunciations, bureaucratic intrigues, and Stalin's support. A quiet war was going on inside the NKVD. Yagoda understood that he was being removed, but he no longer controlled the situation. The system he built himself began to devour its architect. In September 1936, thunder struck. Stalin sent a telegram stating that Yagoda was not coping with his duties. He was removed from the post of head of the NKVD. The appointment was humiliating for a man who kept the whole country in fear. He was transferred to the position of People's Commissar of Communications. In a note dated September 26, 1936, Stalin wrote with mocking politeness, "The People's Commissariat of Communications is a very important matter. I very much ask you to agree to the work at the Commissariat of Communications." Yagoda agreed, but this was only a postponement of the execution. The fall. In January 1937, he was removed from this post as well. He was expelled from the party. At the Central Committee plenum, he was subjected to devastating criticism. On April 4th, newspapers came out with an official announcement. Genrikh Yagoda has been arrested for malfeasance and criminal offenses. The arrest happened even earlier, on March 28, 1937. The accusations grew like a snowball. During the investigation, Yagoda tried to bargain. He signed protocols, hoping to buy time. They broke him not so much physically as psychologically. Threats to his family, promises of visits, hints at a possible pardon. He knew he was being deceived, but continued to cling to any illusion of salvation. First, official crimes. Then, connections with Trotsky and Bukharin. Preparation of an assassination attempt on Stalin. Preparation of a coup d'etat. Espionage for foreign intelligence services. His own former subordinates testified against him, trying to save their own lives. But the most personal and painful was the accusation of murder. He was accused of murdering Maxim Gorky's son, Maxim Peshkov, and the great writer himself. Yagoda admitted guilt, but gave it an unexpected explanation. He stated that he killed Gorky's son for personal reasons, because of a mad infatuation with his wife, Nadezhda Peshkova, who was called Timosha in the family. Betrayal in the cell. A psychological drama played out in the NKVD prison. Playwright Vladimir Kirshon, who was also arrested, was deliberately placed in Yagoda's cell. Kirshon was an informant and was supposed to find out the secrets of the former People's Commissar. Yagoda, broken and lonely, opened up to him. He constantly asked about his wife Ida, about his son, about his love. Timosha. He told Kirshon, "If I could see Ida, I would feel differently at the trial. I would endure everything more easily." Investigators promised him a meeting with his wife in exchange for testimony. Yagoda knew he was being deceived, but continued to cling to this ghostly hope. The trial and last word. March 1938, the third Moscow trial. Yagoda sits on the dock next to Bukharin and Rykov. It was a theater of the absurd, where roles were scripted in advance. To the accusation of espionage, Yagoda unexpectedly snapped back. "If I were a spy, then I assure you that dozens of states would be forced to disband their intelligence services," he threw in the judges' faces. But prosecutor Vyshinsky pressed ruthlessly. The dialogue between them entered the history of judicial chronicles. Vyshinsky asked, "Consequently, you committed direct high treason?" Yagoda answered quietly, "Yes." There is a legend, retold by Boris Bajanov, about one more dialogue that did not make it into the official transcripts. When Vyshinsky pathetically asked if the traitor Yagoda regretted his deeds, he replied, "I regret very much. I regret very much that, when I could have done it, I did not shoot all of you." The Payback. At dawn on March 13th, 1938, the verdict was announced. Execution by firing squad. Yagoda made a last, desperate attempt to survive. He wrote a petition for pardon. "My guilt before the motherland is great. It is hard to die. I stand on my knees before the entire people and the party and ask for mercy." The petition was rejected immediately. The state he created answered him with the same logic as it did millions of others, without explanations, without mercy, without memory. The execution took place on March 15th, 1938. Yagoda's death was arranged with particular cruelty, as the final act of revenge by his successor Yezhov. The place of execution was Special Object Kommunarka. The evil irony of fate lay in the fact that this was the former personal dacha of Yagoda himself. He was brought to die in his own home. Before the execution, on Yezhov's personal orders, the head of the first department, Dagin, brutally beat his former boss. Then Yagoda was forced to watch as other convicts were executed. He was killed last so that he would fully feel the horror of death. The curse of memory. The fate of his family was tragic, like that of millions of victims of his system. His wife, Ida Averbach, was arrested, sent into exile, and shot in 1938. His sisters were repressed. His mother died in a camp. His son Genrikh went through orphanages, took his mother's surname, and hid his origin for many years, until he immigrated to Israel at the end of the 20th century. Even decades later, when Russia began to rehabilitate victims of Stalinist repressions, Yagoda's name remained on the blacklist. In April 2015, the Supreme Court of Russia officially declared Genrikh Yagoda not subject to rehabilitation. The man who created the machine of terror remained the only one of its leaders to whom the state refused even posthumous forgiveness. History remembers Yezhov as a symbol of bloody madness. But it was Yagoda who was the architect of the system. He created the infrastructure, the camp economy, and the managed mechanism of repression. Without him, the Yezhovshchina would have been impossible. He did not simply kill, he made murder part of state logic. He was a monster who devoured himself, leaving behind only blood, fear, and the foundation of the GULAG.